The year was 1847. The Caldwell estate stood in the heart of Wilkes County, Georgia, surrounded by endless fields of cotton swaying under the southern sun. At the top of a gentle hill, the grand house rose like a monument to wealth and power, its white columns gleaming in the light, its wraparound porch overlooking more than 800 acres of land. The name Caldwell carried immense weight among the social elite. Their reputation was built on fortune, but it was the twin daughters, Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell, who stirred the county's curiosity. Identical in every visible way, down. To the small birthmark above their right eyebrows, the sisters had turned 22 that spring, an age by which most women of their standing were already wives and mothers. Yet behind the facade of southern gentility, a quiet unease was taking shape. What no one outside the estate knew was that a series of events had already begun, events that would one day tear apart the very legacy their father had built. County records later uncovered during a courthouse renovation in 1952 revealed a tragic beginning to their story. Their mother had died giving birth to the twins, leaving Thomas Caldwell, their father, to raise them alone. He never remarried. Instead, he buried his grief in his work, expanding his cotton empire and guarding his daughters as though they were his life's only purpose. The first whisper that something was wrong came from a letter, written by the family's longtime housekeeper, Margaret Sullivan, to her sister in Savannah. Dated April 8, 1847, the letter described an unsettling observation. The young misses have taken to spending unusual amounts of time in the quarters, and the master seems strangely unconcerned. That letter would remain hidden for more than a century, pressed between the worn pages of a family Bible. The quarters Margaret referred to were the slave quarters, a small collection of wooden cabins half a mile from the main house, tucked behind a line of oak trees that kept them from view. The Caldwell estate held around 70 enslaved individuals, modest in number compared to neighboring plantations, but enough to sustain its grandeur. Among them were two men, names recorded simply as Samuel and Elijah. Both had been purchased in 1842 from a failing South Carolina plantation. Yet, as later noted by historian William Hartwell, what set them apart was not their origin, but their education. Both men, Samuel and Elijah, possessed a secret that set them apart from most others on the plantation. They had been taught to read and write by the children of their former owner, a dangerous gift that had to be hidden at all costs. For a time, they succeeded, but secrecy has a way of slipping through even the smallest cracks. It was during the autumn of 1846 when Catherine Caldwell stumbled upon Samuel in the stables, quietly reading a discarded newspaper by the flickering light of a lantern. What should have been an act of immediate punishment turned instead into something far more complicated. According to Catherine's personal diary, discovered nearly a century later in 1964, during the demolition of the old plantation house, she did not report him. Instead, she began to meet Samuel in secret. Her early entries are gentle, almost innocent, but as the months pass, her words grow cryptic, filled with phrases like "sis" and "our shared understanding." Around this same period, estate records show that Samuel was reassigned from field work to the stables, a position that brought him closer to the main house and to Catherine herself. What the written record does not confirm, but local oral history insists, is that Elizabeth, Catherine's twin, had also formed a forbidden bond of her own with Elijah, who tended to the vast gardens surrounding the estate. The symmetry of these relationships, two sisters and two enslaved men, formed an eerie pattern that one local newspaper would later describe as a peculiar mirroring of forbidden affections. The winter of 1846 to 1847 struck Georgia with unusual severity. The cold destroyed crops and turned the plantation into an island of silence, roads frozen and impassable. It was during this season of isolation that the secret relationships deepened beyond redemption. A letter written by Thomas Caldwell to his brother in Charleston, dated January 23, 1847, revealed his growing concern. Elizabeth appears stricken with a strange melancholy, he wrote, while Catherine seems almost feverishly alive. I fear the isolation of this winter has touched their minds in opposite ways. What Thomas could not see was that his daughters were not victims of melancholy, but participants in a dangerous web of secrecy, one that defied every law and every moral code of their time. The risk was immense. Discovery meant brutal punishment, possibly death for Samuel and Elijah, and disgrace for the Caldwell name. The first undeniable proof of these hidden connections came in the form of coded messages, scraps of paper found tucked inside a volume of poetry belonging to Elizabeth. The notes, dated throughout February 1847, were brief but intimate, arrangements for meetings and words of devotion. One note read simply, "The usual place at midnight. The moon will be new, offering cover. He says C&S will join. Four Hearts Beating is too." These words revealed a chilling truth. The sisters not only knew of each other's forbidden loves, but were acting together, carefully coordinating their meetings under the cover of darkness. Their identical appearances, it seemed, were being used to mislead any watchful eyes, allowing them to move undetected. Then came the night that would change everything. On March 15, 1847, during dinner, Thomas Caldwell announced that he had arranged marriages for both his daughters to the sons of neighboring plantation owners. According to Catherine's diary, she received the news with outward calm. Beneath my smile, my heart turned to stone. Elizabeth's reaction went unrecorded, but what followed suggests her feelings were no different. 3 nights later, in the early hours of March 18th, the plantation's overseer, James Whitaker, awoke to what he later described in a deposition as a commotion unlike any I had heard before. A fire had broken out in one of the storage buildings near the slave quarters. It was swiftly contained, but what followed sent the entire estate into panic. Samuel, Elijah, and the Caldwell twins were gone. Search parties were assembled before dawn. Neighboring plantations were alerted, and riders scoured every road leading away from the property. The first assumption, recorded in Whitaker's own journal, was that the enslaved men had fled, taking the Caldwell sisters with them. A reward was issued, and soon the manhunt grew into one of the largest the county had ever seen. Thomas Caldwell, consumed by grief and fury, refused rest or food. Witnesses later described him as a man driven beyond the reach of reason. But what the searchers did not know, and what would not come to light until years later, was that the fire had not been an accident. It had been a distraction, deliberately set by Elizabeth Caldwell herself. This revelation surfaced in 1868 when a former house servant named Ruth recounted her memories to a northern journalist collecting stories of the antebellum South. According to Ruth, Elizabeth had come to her hours before the fire, instructing her to remain silent about what she knew. The search continued for weeks, spreading beyond county lines and into neighboring states. Meanwhile, Thomas Caldwell's health began to fail. Records show that by April, he had taken to his bed, attended only by his longtime servant and a physician from Augusta, who was called twice during that month. Then, on May the 2nd, 1847, a letter arrived at the Caldwell estate. Its contents were never revealed to the public, but what happened next was undeniable. Upon reading it, Thomas Caldwell suffered a violent outburst of rage, followed by a collapse from which he never recovered. He died 3 days later. His death was recorded simply as apoplexy, what modern medicine would call a stroke. After his passing, the management of the plantation fell to his brother, Edward Caldwell, who arrived from Charleston to settle the family's affairs. During his careful inspection of Thomas's private study, Edward uncovered a small wooden box. Inside were documents that would shake the remaining family to its core. 2 crudely drawn marriage certificates, signed and dated March 17, 1847. One recorded the union of Elizabeth Caldwell and Elijah, the other of Catherine Caldwell and Samuel. The discovery came with a weight that Edward Caldwell could barely comprehend. Inside the box lay several certificates, documents that confirmed marriages between the Caldwell twins and 2 men once enslaved on the estate. Accompanying them was a letter, written in Catherine's delicate handwriting. In it, she confessed that she and Elizabeth had fallen deeply in love with Samuel and Elijah. Knowing their father would never approve, they had devised a plan to flee the South altogether. Catherine described how they had spent months preparing in secret, collecting supplies, saving coins, and mapping their way toward the north. There, she hoped, they could live without the constant fear of being torn apart. But what struck Edward most was not the act of rebellion itself. It was the choice. His nieces had not been abducted. They had left willingly, abandoning their wealth, their comfort, and their name for what Catherine called the only true happiness we have ever known. Edward's world collapsed under the weight of that revelation. After long consultations with lawyers and relatives, he made a choice that would forever shape the family's legacy. He buried the truth. The certificates and the letter were sealed away, hidden from public sight. Officially, he maintained that the twins had been kidnapped, perhaps even murdered by escaped slaves. The search continued, now no longer for the living, but for bodies. For nearly 20 years, that lie endured, until 1865, when the Civil War ended and the world Edward knew began to crumble. One quiet afternoon, a woman arrived at what remained of the Caldwell plantation. She called herself Margaret Johnson. The property had shrunk to a shadow of its former glory, but when Edward saw her, his heart nearly stopped. The resemblance to the long-lost twins was undeniable. She requested a private meeting, which lasted several hours. Staff outside later recalled hearing raised voices from behind the study doors. When Margaret finally departed, Edward emerged pale and trembling. He spoke to no one, but within weeks began selling everything he owned. 6 months later, the plantation was gone, and Edward vanished into quiet seclusion in Charleston. He died in 1871, taking his secret with him, or so it seemed. Nearly a century later, in 1958, a box of family letters was donated to the Georgia Historical Society by Edward's granddaughter. Among them lay a letter he had written to his wife, dated the day after that mysterious meeting. In that letter, the truth finally resurfaced. Margaret Johnson was none other than Catherine Caldwell, living under her married name. She revealed that after escaping, she and Samuel, along with Elizabeth and Elijah, had reached Philadelphia, aided by abolitionists, who helped them build new lives under false identities. Elizabeth and Elijah had moved on to Boston, where Elijah worked as a carpenter. Samuel had opened a small stable, and Catherine became a seamstress. Both couples had children, all raised without ever knowing the truth of their mother's past. Catherine had returned to Georgia not for wealth, but for memory. She wanted to retrieve her mother's belongings and to correct the false story that had defined her life. She wished the world to know that she and her sister had not been victims, but women who had chosen love and freedom over fear. Edward, however, refused. In his letter, he wrote that to reveal the truth would bring shame upon their name and destroy his brother's legacy. He offered Catherine money to ensure her silence and her promise never to return. Whether she accepted or not remains unknown, but historical records show that she boarded a train to Philadelphia the next morning and never came back. The false tale of abduction remained untouched. Over time, it hardened into local legend. When a courthouse fire in 1883 destroyed many county records, the last fragments of truth disappeared with it. By the early 1900s, the story of the Caldwell twins had become folklore, colored by rumor, haunted by whispers of ghosts and curses. It would take another 60 years and one final discovery to bring their voices back from the silence. The legend of the Caldwell twins might have remained nothing more than a ghost story, if not for what came to light in the years that followed. Throughout the 1960s, researchers began uncovering fragments that reshaped everything once believed. Shipping logs from Savannah revealed that in late March of 1847, 4 passengers, listed under the names Johnson and Davis, had boarded a northbound vessel bound for Philadelphia. Philadelphia's census of 1850 confirmed their presence. There, a Samuel and Catherine Johnson, recorded as mulatto, lived quietly in a black neighborhood with 2 young children. Further north in Boston, an Elijah and Elizabeth Davis appeared in the same year's records, also listed as mulatto with 1 child of their own. Then, in 1968, the story took another turn. A descendant of Elizabeth and Elijah Davis, by then a professor at a New England university, came forward after reading of the renewed historical investigation. In his possession were dozens of letters exchanged between the twins during the 1850s and 60s. Those letters opened a window into their hidden lives. They spoke of work and education, of raising children, of joy and fear. They described nights spent reading by candlelight, and mornings when they dared to believe they had finally found peace. But even in freedom, they carried the weight of danger. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 meant that anyone of mixed descent could be seized and returned to bondage. For the Caldwells, every knock at the door could mean exposure. One letter, dated July 4, 1865, just after the end of the Civil War, stood apart from the rest. Catherine wrote, "Today marks not only the independence of this nation, but also, at long last, our own true freedom. For 18 years we have lived in shadows. Now, though many challenges remain, we may finally step into the light. Yet, I find myself thinking of Father. Perhaps, freed from the world that shaped him, he might at last understand." By 1969, historians had gathered enough evidence to rewrite the record. The supposed abduction of the Caldwell twins was no longer viewed as tragedy, but transformation, an act of defiance that shattered the boundaries of race, class, and expectation. 2 women of privilege had risked everything to live by conscience rather than comfort. Their descendants, now scattered across the North, chose privacy. Only a few agreed to interviews during the 1970s. Most had grown up hearing carefully edited versions of their ancestry, tales of northern women who had married men of mixed heritage. The truth, when finally revealed, came as both a shock and a reckoning. Some descendants spoke with pride, calling their ancestors courageous. Others admitted to a quiet unease, struggling to reconcile their lineage with a legacy built on both enslavement and rebellion. Today, the land that once held the Caldwell plantation has vanished beneath development. A small roadside marker placed in 1972 mentions the estate by name, but says nothing of the sisters who defied its walls. Over time, public perception shifted. Where once there was denial, there grew respect, a recognition that the Caldwell twins had done something extraordinary. Their story became a rare example of Southern women rejecting the very system that defined them. Academics took interest. Scholars studying resistance to slavery began to cite the Caldwell case as proof that moral awakening was possible even among those born into power. It revealed how love and conscience could sometimes rise above centuries of conditioning, even when such defiance came at immense personal cost. In her diary, Catherine had written, "We did not choose to be born into a world of masters and slaves, but we can choose whether to accept it." That choice became their legacy, a testament to the human capacity for courage in the face of injustice. Yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of their story is not what was found, but what was lost. The silence that followed, the careful erasure of truth, reminds us how many similar stories vanished from history. What remains of Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell now lives only in fragments, diary pages, fading letters, and census entries that confirm their existence but cannot reveal their dreams. The house where they were born is gone. The fields where Samuel and Elijah once labored are unrecognizable. All that endures is the story itself, preserved not in stone, but in memory, a whisper from the past, asking questions the present still struggles to answer. As for the wooden box, the one that held their forbidden marriage certificates, its fate remains unknown. Some believe Edward Caldwell destroyed it, unable to face the truth it contained. Others think it may still lie hidden in some forgotten archive, waiting for the light of day. And so, the search continues, not only for that box, but for understanding. Because, in the end, the story of the Caldwell twins is not merely about love or loss. It is about the quiet revolution of 2 hearts that refused to obey the world they were born into. A reminder that history is not written only by those in power, but also by those brave enough to break free. The hidden pages of Samuel's journal. He wrote about every detail, the months of preparation, the whispered plans under candlelight, the quiet gathering of supplies, maps, and hope. Each entry carried the weight of survival. They memorized the routes of the Underground Railroad, trusting strangers who would become their salvation. Their 6-week journey north was a shadowed odyssey. They traveled only by night, hiding by day beneath barns, in fields, and beneath wagons loaded with grain. The danger was constant, and fear lived in their throats. In one entry, dated April 2, 1847, Samuel described the moment that nearly cost them everything. Today we almost met disaster. A patrol stopped the wagon that carried us beneath sacks of grain. Elizabeth, her hands trembling, spoke to the officer with a voice steady as steel. She claimed we were bound to visit relatives. I could feel Catherine shaking beside me, but she never made a sound. When the wagon rolled on, we sat in silence, afraid even to breathe. Through these pages, Samuel revealed not just their escape, but the cost of freedom itself. He spoke of guilt for those left behind on the Caldwell plantation, the haunting uncertainty of what awaited them, and the struggle of learning how to live when every shadow could still mean capture. And between those lines, he wrote of Catherine, her quiet strength, her doubts, her sacrifices. She sometimes speaks of what she gave up to be with me, he confessed in 1852. I know what she sacrificed, perhaps more than she does. I see her gaze linger on the women in fine dresses passing by. Yet when she turns to me, her eyes carry the same resolve, the same choice she made for love and freedom, imperfect though it may be. But even as the years passed, the past never fully released them. Catherine continued to exchange letters with Margaret Sullivan, the former housekeeper who once noticed the twins' strange behavior. Through Margaret's quiet updates, Catherine learned of her father's death and her uncle's control of the Caldwell estate. That news led to her fateful return to Georgia in 1865, a journey Samuel called foolhardy, but necessary for her peace of mind. She came back changed, haunted. Samuel wrote that her father had died believing she'd been taken against her will, perhaps murdered. That belief, he wrote, burdened her more than anything I could heal. Then, nearly a century later, another discovery added to the story. In 1967, researchers unearthed baptismal records from a small African Methodist Episcopal church in Philadelphia. They revealed that Catherine and Elizabeth had become godmothers to each other's children, a silent promise that their bond endured through everything. But their lives remained restless. The families moved every few years, escaping the shadows cast by the Fugitive Slave Act. By 1855, Samuel managed to build a modest livery business, his name listed in Philadelphia's city records not as an escaped slave, but as a business owner, a quiet victory carved from defiance. Elizabeth and Elijah found refuge in rural Massachusetts. He built furniture by hand. She taught children to read. Their isolation brought them safety, and perhaps a rare peace. In 1968, historians made one final discovery. Under pseudonyms, the sisters had written letters to abolitionist papers like The Liberator. Their words struck with truth sharper than any blade. Slavery, one letter read, is a poison that corrupts the soul of the master as surely as it breaks the body of the slave. The Civil War came and went. Samuel's later entries trembled between hope and fear. When Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation reached them in 1863, he wrote, "For the first time, the nation admits what we always knew. No man has the right to own another." The war's end brought a fragile calm. Yet, even in freedom, they lived cautiously, never speaking of their origins. In 1873, Samuel died of pneumonia at 50. The records list him simply as colored business owner. No note of the peril he survived or the legacy he left behind. Catherine carried on the business alone until she retired to her daughter's home in New York, where she passed quietly in 1890, at peace, perhaps at last. Elizabeth outlived her sister by nearly a decade. She passed away in 1900 at her quiet farm in Massachusetts, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew her only as a woman of uncommon grace, not as someone who had once fled the world she was born into. According to letters preserved by her descendants, she sometimes told stories from her youth in Georgia, though the most dangerous parts, the escape, the new identities, the forbidden love, were left unsaid. Yet one letter, written in 1895 to her granddaughter on the girl's 18th birthday, revealed more of her heart than she perhaps intended. "My dearest girl," she wrote, "as you stand at the threshold of womanhood, remember this. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Life will test you. You will face choices between what is expected and what is right. Choose truth. Choose freedom. No comfort or luxury is worth the price of a compromised soul." That letter, now kept in the Massachusetts Historical Society, remains one of the most powerful windows into Elizabeth's mind. A woman who had known both captivity and liberty, and who understood that real freedom always demands sacrifice. But the record, even after all this, remains incomplete. No photograph of the Caldwell twins has ever surfaced. Only a daguerreotype believed to show Samuel and Catherine's eldest son, taken in Philadelphia around 1870, survives, a young man whose face mirrors that of Thomas Caldwell, their father. a haunting echo of the lineage they both defied and carried forward. In 1969, archaeologists uncovered the ruins of the old Caldwell plantation. Among the broken brick and rusted iron, they found a small carved wooden bird, the same one Catherine once wrote about in her diary, a gift from Samuel. That fragile carving now rests behind museum glass, a silent witness to a love that refused to obey the rules of its time. Over the years, their story has inspired historians, novelists, even playwrights. Yet outside academic circles, few know their names, perhaps because their story makes people uncomfortable. It blurs the lines between villain and victim, privilege and punishment. It forces us to see the antebellum South, not as a simple tale of cruelty and innocence, but as a world where even the privileged could awaken, rebel, and lose everything for the sake of what was right. Unlike the many tragic tales of exploitation between white masters and enslaved women, the Caldwell twins' story stands apart. Two white Southern women who fell in love with enslaved men, and instead of hiding it, escaped with them. They did the unthinkable. They rejected the power they were born into, and chose the truth of their hearts over the comfort of their world. In a 1968 oral history interview, one of Elizabeth's great-granddaughters reflected on their legacy. When I think of what they risked, their comfort, their lives, just to do what was right, it humbles me. They looked at the world they were born into and said, "No, this is wrong. I won't be part of it." That kind of courage is rare in any time. The story of the Caldwell twins now exists between history and legend. Real enough to be documented, mysterious enough to haunt every archive that mentions their name. The facts are there. Two daughters vanished from a Georgia plantation in 1847. Two families reappeared in the North under new names. One returned to face her past after the war. But much of the rest is fragments. Letters with missing pages, diary lines fading with age, memories distorted by time. And yet, in 2002, another whisper from the past surfaced. During the renovation of an old boarding house in Philadelphia, workers found a small pouch hidden inside a chimney. Inside lay a gold locket containing two miniature portraits, young women with identical faces, dressed in the fashion of the 1840s. On a folded slip of paper beneath it were written the words, "Elizabeth and Catherine, Georgia, 1844. Experts believe Catherine hid the locket before returning south in 1865, perhaps fearing she might never come back. It now stands as their final message across time. Two faces captured in paint, two souls bound by love, defiance, and the quiet hope that their story would, one day, be found. Nothing in those serene portraits hints at the storm that would follow just 3 years later. The calm expressions, the delicate lace, the practiced posture. None reveal the impossible choice these young women were about to make. A choice that would shatter the world those paintings represent and carry them toward lives they could scarcely have imagined when the artist set down his brush. Today, the descendants of the Caldwell twins and of Samuel and Elijah live quietly across the United States. Many have no idea that their lineage traces back to one of the most remarkable acts of defiance in Southern history. Those who do know speak of their ancestors with a mixture of pride and unease, pride in their moral courage and unease at the paradox it represents. For the Caldwell twins were both beneficiaries and rebels. Born into privilege, yet brave enough to renounce it in protest of the injustice it sustained. Where once stood the grand plantation, there are now quiet suburban streets. Children play where fields of cotton once stretched to the horizon. The only reminder of what once was is a small weathered plaque by the roadside. A line of text so ordinary that few stop to read it. No hint of the human drama that unfolded here remains. And perhaps in a way that invisibility is fitting. Because the story of the Caldwell twins was never meant for monuments. It is a story about the invisible threads that bind us, across class, color, and time. About the quiet rebellions that history rarely records. About the courage to imagine a different life than the one society commands. In her final diary entry before the escape, Catherine wrote, "Tomorrow we step into darkness, not knowing if we will find light on the other side, but even the darkness of uncertainty is better than the false brightness of a life built on others' suffering. Whatever comes, we have chosen our path freely, perhaps the first truly free choice of our lives. That choice, made on a March night in 1847 by two privileged young women and two enslaved men, still echoes across the centuries. It stands as a testament to the power of conscience, to the human capacity for moral awakening even in the darkest corners of history. The echo grows fainter with each passing year, as memories fade, as documents turn to dust, as the red Georgia earth reclaims what was once the Caldwell plantation. The story might have been lost entirely. And yet it persists, a whisper from the past, still powerful enough to disturb, to move, to remind us of what it means to stand against injustice, not with anger, but with conviction. In that sense, the Caldwell story is not only about the past. It is about now, about the choices we make, the boundaries we accept, and the truths we are willing to risk everything for. Their legacy does not live in marble or stone, but in the ongoing struggle of humanity to recognize and honor the dignity of others, whatever the cost. And so, the story ends where it began. 4 figures stepping into the darkness of a Georgia night, leaving behind everything they had ever known for the uncertain promise of freedom. We know that they made it. What we can never fully know is the depth of courage it took to take that first step, to walk away from comfort, from certainty, from the world that defined them. In that single defiant moment lies the heart of their story, and perhaps the heart of ours as well, because every generation faces its own darkness. And like them, we must each decide what we are willing to risk, for love, for justice, and for the chance to live in the light.